start by looking at the title of this lecture that I prepared for you today, which I promise to make entertaining, informative, enlightening, enjoyable, hopefully. So, let's look at this title. First and foremost, it's about Manila in the Philippines. Secondly, it's about the Spaniards, or as I will often refer in my lecture, the Mexicans, because I'm really talking about the Spaniards in Mexico. So I call them Mexicans in order to remind you that I'm talking about Spaniards from Mexico. I'm also talking about Chinatown, the Chinatown of Manila, and the Chinese settlers of that Chinatown. I'm going to be talking about the Pacific and the Trans-Pacific and the Maritime Trans-Pacific. And of course, I'm talking about America, no? American Chinatown. And my approach to America, which should already be kind of coming out clearly to all of you, it is a hemispheric definition of America. I think it's too narrow and somewhat ethnocentric to equate America with USA America, because America is also Canada, America is South America, Latin America, Central America, and so Mexico is part of America. So I will use that term America a lot. So these are the 5 different things, 5 different places, 5 different concepts that I will be trying to put together in this lecture today. And I have this PowerPoint so that you can all follow me easily. All right. I'm going to lay out my thesis right at the outset so you know what I'm going to be talking about and what I'm trying to demonstrate. So this is what my lecture will try to illuminate, the 4 propositions. I call them 4 propositions. First, the history of the Chinese in Manila and the trade with Mexico of the Spanish-American Empire was the first real globalization in world history. Second, the Chinese were indispensable to the Mexican enterprise in Manila. Without the Chinese, the Mexicans would not have been able to carry out this trans-Pacific commercial enterprise called the Manila galleon trade for 250 years, from 1565 to 1815. Without a break, every year, 1 to 3 galleons would sail the Pacific, exchanging silver for Chinese silks and other fine goods. And without the Chinese, the Mexicans could not have survived in Manila, a place so far from America. Third, the Manila Chinese community can be considered the first American Chinatown, for Manila was an extension of Mexico in the Americas and lay at the edge of the Spanish-American Empire. Now, I'll give you a chance at the end of the lecture to argue with me about this and dispute this and tell me how annoyed you are, but I'm laying it out there. And I will show you why I say that. Moreover, Manila became the first and biggest permanent overseas Chinese community in the 16th century, thus marking the beginning of the Chinese diaspora, which is a history of overseas Chinese, or Huaqiao. Okay. So let's start with a bit of historical background. You probably know all of this, but just a recap. 1492, Christopher Columbus tried to reach Las Indias, which was the medieval term for Asia, by sailing west from Spain, and stumbled on America, he discovered America, as the textbooks say. So he got stuck in America and never got to Asia. Meanwhile, in 1497, a Portuguese by the name of Vasco da Gama sailed from Portugal to India by another route, by going around Africa into the Indian Ocean. I'm going to have some maps real soon to illustrate all this. 1519 to 22, Magellan and Elcano circumnavigated the globe. That is, they made a round trip. No, they went around the globe, circumnavigated. Magellan himself was killed on Cebu Island of the Philippines, but Elcano made his way home to Spain. They crossed all the great oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian. So here, look at this map. This is what I'm talking about. This is a... Now, you know, it's very hard to put the map, which is a globe, on a flat sheet. So you have to follow me, right? So I'm talking about the Americas. Here is America, and you can see, if you have a sharp eye, that America was, here's the United States of America, here's Mexico, here's the rest of Latin America, here's the Caribbean. No? And Mexico, until the middle of the 19th century, was indeed this big, because Mexico, until the middle of the 19th century, included what is today California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. A huge chunk of the United States was taken from Mexico. Now look at Spain here, or the Iberian Peninsula, which juts out into the Atlantic. And of course, this is Africa, and this is the Atlantic. And you can see the Atlantic is quite a small ocean, because by comparison, this is the Pacific. Pacific is twice as big as the Atlantic. And on the other end of the Pacific, of course, is Great China. And not far from China is this group of islands or archipelago, later named Las Filipinas, or the Philippines in the plural. Now this map is not as good as I would like it, but I gotta figure out a better way. But look at here. Here's Africa, and here is the Indian Ocean. No? Here's India, and if we go around Africa, we know that we come back to China and Nanyang, the South Seas, and this region of the world that we are now currently sitting on. And of course, this is Australia, but the Pacific. Okay. This map illustrates how Vasco da Gama went from Portugal around Africa into the Indian Ocean and India and Southeast Asia, Nanyang, Indonesian islands, China, Philippines, Japan, Taiwan. No? So this was the other route that the Portuguese used and made into their passage to India. You know? Now, while the Europeans were doing all this exploration and probably thinking they're so great and adventurous and smart and risky, guess what? Back there in Asia and in the Indian Ocean, there were many people who were already sailing, no, from one part to another of this great Indian Ocean world. And we know him as Zheng He, but it wasn't just Zheng He. There were people before Zheng He, there were people after Zheng He, but it's important to note that Zheng He made many voyages from the beginning to the middle of the 15th century around Nanyang, this area that we are in, across the Indian Ocean to India and to Sri Lanka, all the way to the east coast of Africa, and very importantly to the Arabian Peninsula and to places like Hormuz, which is Iran and Persia, as well as Aden, which is in Yemen today, but all of this Arabian Peninsula world. No? And of course, if you keep on going, you will eventually end up in the Mediterranean and in Europe. But Zheng He Unlike Gavin Menzies, no, contrary to Gavin Menzies, 1423, the year China discovered America, we don't think Zheng He ever made it to Europe and from Europe to America. That's a little apocryphal. Okay, so here's just another different kind of map to make it clearer how the Zheng He voyages. And I have to emphasize this because all this was going on in the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15th century when the Europeans were just venturing out into the oceans, no? And, quote, discovering America. All this was going on. So after Columbus, Spain colonized North America in 1521 and created the Viceroyalty of New Spain with a seat of power in Mexico City, which was the old Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. We don't have time to go into that beautiful history before the arrival of the Europeans, but Mexico City was built on top of the old Aztec capital. Among the first generation of Spanish settlers was Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, whom the crown dispatched to take the islands that they later on named Philippines in 1564, because they were already very concerned about the Portuguese traders who were lurking around. Now, the Spaniards claimed that the line that the Pope drew, called the Tordesillas line, gave them all of the Pacific until Manila, and that the Portuguese can take the rest of it. See? So they wanted to claim their part of the Tordesillas line before the Portuguese got any bolder. Now, Legazpi took with him another very important person who happened to be a brilliant navigator, but also an Augustinian monk. His name was Andres de Urdaneta. They left from a little port on the Pacific coast side of Mexico called Acapulco. I know everybody knows Acapulco today because it is a world-renowned resort area, but at that time it's just a little backwaters port on the Pacific side. They went across the Pacific. They took the Philippines. They named it after Felipe II. They named it Las Filipinas. And in 1565, shortly after they arrived, they first went to Cebu Island. Legazpi dispatched Urdaneta to find a way back across the Pacific to Acapulco. And Urdaneta indeed succeeded in doing so because he had been part of previous expeditions from Mexico to the Spice Islands of Malacca. So he was already generally familiar. He had probably studied all the sailors' logs and books of Zheng He and the other traders in the region before them, because he was very knowledgeable. And he figured out how to cross the Pacific in the first round-trip voyage of the Pacific, the first circumnavigation. And when he went back to Acapulco, using the silver they had brought with them from Mexico, they bought lots of beautiful silk and ceramics and other goods from the Indian Ocean world. And this is the beginning, the first launch, the launch and the first ship of the Manila galleon trade, 1565. Remember, this trade lasted until 1815. No? So this is the circumnavigation of the Pacific. No? Leaving from Acapulco, Mexico, they went pretty much straight, no, to Manila, because Manila is fairly even. Do you see that? But on the return, Urdaneta took the northern route, went close to Japan, and then crossed over to what later on would be California, and then turned southward back to Acapulco. This is the round-trip voyage. And if you look at the Pacific here are the Hawaiian Islands, and there's not much more in this northern part of the Pacific. There are more islands in the southern part closer to Australia. But in the northern part of the Pacific, the only other two major groups of islands were the Mariana Islands Originally, they were called the ladrones. Ladrón is the Spanish word for thieves, because when they landed in Mariana Islands, they thought the local people were thieves because they took the things that the Spaniards had, probably out of curiosity. And here's another group of islands called Guam, which is still a U.S. territory today. And in order to make this long voyage home, the Spaniards also colonized Mariana, which they named after the Queen of Spain. The Ladrón is a little coarse, right, the name. So, and then Guam, and so today if you go to Mariana and Guam, you hear the people who we still call Chamorros speaking a language, a Creole language that has a lot of Spanish in it. No? So when Legazpi landed in Cebu, he immediately met Chinese there. And the local people say, yeah, these Chinese, these people called Sangley, which that's why I asked some of you here if they're Hokkien speakers. Sangley, we think, comes from the Hokkien for Xiong which means come and go frequently. No? That's what the local people, because the Philippine Islands were inhabited by local people, no? By indigenous local people. And these Hokkien people were mostly junk traders. Junk is the name that we give to these Chinese ships called chuan. And those are the junk traders who went all around the Indian Ocean and the Nanyang in the wake of the Zheng He voyages, following in his steps. So they were the legacies of Zheng He, and they came from primarily, as I said, southern Fujian, the area we call Minnan, and these three major cities. The city of Xiamen, which was called Amoy, the city of Quanzhou, which Marco Polo called Caitung, and the city of Zhangzhou, which the Spaniards named Chincheo. So this is a rendition of a small Amoy junk or chuan. I hate the word junk because it sounds like garbage, but these are not garbage, I assure you. And then we have a Spanish rendition of a Chinese junk or chuan. And these are the cities then, right? In southern Fujian. Can you see them? Across from Taiwan, no? That's Xiamen, right? That's Quanzhou, and here's Zhangzhou, no? So these three coastal areas. And I want to show you here in this other place, because you can see its proximity to the Philippines, no? of southern Fujian to the Philippines, okay? Back to the map I showed you earlier, these Hokkien traders were actively trading around the Indian Ocean, calling at all of these different ports and bartering and trading for the goods, particularly beautiful objects, that then they would take and trade elsewhere. So when the Spaniards got there, when the Mexicans got to Manila, they saw all these beautiful goods, and they knew they had a good thing going. In 1571, Legazpi built Manila on the large island of Luzon to be the capital of Las Filipinas, and here again, and as an extension of the Spanish-American colony of New Spain or Mexico. They did not create a brand new colony. They did not give it a different name. They call it part of New Spain. Oh? And the Chinese, as we will see, who were already there and gathering in numbers, were told to live outside the city wall in a special quarter established for them called El Parian, which became the Chinatown, or in Spanish, the Barrio Chino. So one of the scholars who studied the Manila galleon trade described it this way: a Spanish Orient might be made an adjunct of Spanish America, no? An extension of Spanish America into the Orient. And therefore the Manila galleon trade was considered intercolonial within the colony. And contemporary maps envisioned the West Indies extending all the way to Las Filipinas. The West Indies, remember the word Indies is their word for the Orient, but when Columbus landed in America, he insisted, because he wanted to collect his reward from the Spanish crown, no? Isabel and Ferdinand, so he stamped on his feet and he says, I am in Las Indias. No, he never relented, even though everybody around him knew this was not where they thought they were going. But the name stuck, no? And how they then differentiated, they called the extension Las Indias Occidentales, the West Indies. And look at this great map that I found. It's published in 1601, but it was actually made based on information around 1585. No? It's a map called Las Indias Occidentales. Do you see that the Indias Occidentales extended all the way to Las Filipinas? Right? So, you know, space is an interesting thing. Geography is an interesting thing. It's very subjective. No? God did not hand down a booklet that says this is the way the world is going to be divided with these place names. See? So I thought this was very interesting. And let me fast forward because I want to show you the idea of America and Asia being connected. Persisted all the way to this map, 1771. A little divergence here. Because what is this map called? It is really the map of the Pacific Ocean close to California, the Gulf of California. But look at the title of this map, Oceano Asiatico, the Asian Ocean. Now, you know, I can't tell you how important this is and how emphatic I am about this because we, at least in the United States, have a very Eurocentric and very ethnocentric view of world history. And in my studies of Latin American history and American history, we always think of America as an Atlantic project. No? That everything about America, everywhere in America, we look only towards Europe and towards the Atlantic. And I am here to tell you that that is not so. That from the very beginning, America also looked towards Asia, perhaps even more so than the other direction. So, I'm here to tell you that. Anyway, this is how they ended up in Manila because of Manila Bay, which provided very good protection. One of the things I don't have time to talk about are the pirates. Pirates are not just in the Caribbean with Johnny Depp. They're all over Asia. No? Pirates, you see. But anyway, this is the way they had to weave their way through these islands and into Manila Bay. And in Manila, they quickly built the Spanish city of Manila, and it is a walled city. So if you've been to Manila, how many of you been to Manila? I know at least one. You can still see a bit of the Intramuros. Do you remember the city wall? A lot of it was bombed during World War II, which is such a regretful thing. But there still remains a piece of the city wall, and that's called Intramuros. Very early on, the Spaniards says, but we don't want the Sangley to live inside the city wall. We don't want them to live too close to us. So they built another city right outside the city wall, up the Pasig River. This is Manila Bay. This is the Pasig River. This is the city wall. Right outside the city wall, they built the Chinatown called Parian. And this is a wonderful Spanish painting of the Parian. Do you see the city wall? No? The Parian right outside the city wall. These are the Chinese junks sailing down the Pasig River, going into the Parian, no? Laden with goods from China. Now, let's take a look at the early years of Manila. We're talking about the 16th century. The Spaniards or Mexicans numbered 500 to 1,000, very small population, and in only 5 categories. They were government officials and administrators. They were settlers and conquistadores in the first generation anyway. They were priests and missionaries. They were soldiers and officers, and of course they were merchants and businessmen. But there's a lot of people missing from this. As you will see, and as you can already surmise. Meanwhile, the Sangley population, the Chinese population, grew very fast, from about 150 at the point of contact in 1564 to 10,000 in 1586 to 25,000 in 1596 and to 30,000 in 1603. 85% of them were Hokkien, or people from those three southern Fujian cities, of Amoy, Zhangzhou, Qinzhou, and Quanzhou, Caitung. So these are some early illustrations of the Sangley, or they call them, the term really took hold. Now what is this? This is a Christian Chinese, because as you will see, and this is a history of Spanish America, first come the conquistadores, then right on their heels would come the missionaries, right? Because the justification for colonization was always the religious justification. So this is a portrait of a Christian Chinese who would then cut his hair, could wear a hat and Western clothing. Back on the other side in Acapulco then, this is a lookout. And what he's saying is, oh, the galleon ships have arrived into Acapulco Bay. This is a painting, 1628. And these are the galleon ships we're talking about. They're just like the ships in the Pirates of the Caribbean. In fact, the movie modeled the Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny Depp's ship, right exactly after these Spanish galleons. And the Acapulco Fair then suddenly would draw people from all over the Americas, not just Mexico, but from Peru, from Cuba, from other places, to come and claim their goods off the galleon, to negotiate and to exchange and to do whatever they could to buy whatever they wanted. And then they would carry these goods either to where they came from, but the majority of them would go to Mexico City. And here in the main square of Mexico City was another market which they named after the Filipino Chinatown. They call it the Parian. And this was the end of the Camino de China, the end of the China Road. And you can get this is a painting, and then you can get a sense of the enormity of this big Mexico City market. So I call this the first real globalization. Because what happened is a Manila galleon trade between Manila and Acapulco linked all the inhabited regions of the world in one global commercial trade system. From Acapulco, a lot of the merchandise would be transshipped by land to Veracruz, another port on the Atlantic side, and from there it would be taken to Europe, to Spain, and from Spain distributed all over Europe and even parts of North Africa. So the Manila galleon trade then connected all the inhabited regions of the world into one global commercial system that continued for 250 years. We're talking about Europe, America, China, the Nanyang, the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, or Central Asia, Africa. The only exception was Australia, because it had not yet been, quote, discovered by anyone outside of Australia. So here you see all the red parts, all connected, and then the Indian Ocean world. Real globalization. That was my first point. Secondly, I want to talk about what went on in this Manila galleon trade in some detail. This is a description by a Jesuit father who happened to be in Manila. And he said Manila is an equal of any other emporium of our monarchy, our Spanish Empire. For it is a center to which flow the riches of the Orient and the Occident. I put in red all the place names. The silver of Peru, which today is Bolivia, and New Spain or Mexico. The pearls and precious stones of India, the diamonds of Narsinga and Goa, which are places in the Indian subcontinent, the rubies, sapphires, topazes, and cinnamon Don't forget the spices of Ceylon, the pepper of Sumatra, and from Great China, silks of all kinds, raw and woven in velvets and damask taffetas and other cloths of every texture, design, and colors, linens and cotton fabrics, gilt-decorated articles, embroideries and porcelains, and other riches and curiosities of great value and esteem. They also brought a lot of fabrics from India, no? But the bulk of the fabrics that they brought to America, from America to Europe, as you will see, were the silk. And silk would constitute the biggest item, biggest amount of merchandise on these galleon ships. Now, very soon, the Spaniards or the Mexicans learned about silk. And this is a beautiful description of the intricate variety of silk and the diverse qualities of silk. The finest two-strand raw silk in bundles and other silk of coarser quality, fine untwisted silk, white and of all colors, wound in small skeins, quantities of velvet, some plain and some embroidered in all sorts of figures, colors, and fashions, others with gold bodies and embroidery, woven stuffs and brocades of gold and silver thread in skeins, damask, satins, taffeta, and other cloths of different kinds and quantities. And this description was offered by Antonio de Morga, who was a high government official sent to the King of Spain to describe the types of silk they were exporting. What else? Musk, benzoin, ivory, many bed ornaments, hangings, coverlets, and tapestries, tablecloths, cushions, carpets, horse trappings, glass beads, seed pearls, pearls and rubies, sapphires and crystal. These guys just trip over themselves describing these gorgeous, wonderful things they were getting from the Hokkien traders who brought them all these things for them to load on the galleon ships and take across to America and to Europe. Even the Chinese noticed this, because a book, the first book commissioned by the Ming Emperor, 1617, to write about the land and the seas beyond China and to provide full descriptions of the Chinese who were venturing to these places. This is a book called Dong Xi Yang Kao, okay? Chronicle of the countries of the East and West Oceans. And this is what he said about the Chinese who went to Manila. He said the Chinese who went to Luzon, Luzon was a name they gave to all of the Philippines, but particularly to the area of Manila and the big island of Luzon, are consequently many. They often stayed on and did not return, and they call this Ya Dong, to pass the winter. They stayed together in the Giangnay, in the Parian, which is a Hokkien word for the Parian, to make their living. And the numbers gradually rose to several tens of thousands. This last line is particularly significant. One hears that some cut their hair and produce sons and grandsons. Cutting the hair was one way of saying they adopted Christianity. And then producing sons and grandsons, meaning generations overseas. No? So I am now suggesting that this was not only the first American Chinatown, but it is the beginning of what we call the Chinese diaspora. It is really the first permanent settlement of Chinese outside of China. Before that, the Hokkien traders were going around the Indian Ocean world and the Nanyang world, but they always went back. They only went out with their crew for periods of time. And that's why we call them in English, the word often used is sojourner. They were just travelers, no? But they were not described by Chinese because China never even recognized the concept of immigration, of settling overseas. In fact, it was against the law. No? But this chronicler, no, Zhang Xie, he said, look, these Chinese in Manila, in the Kiangnay, in the Parian, they're cutting their hair. They're having children and grandchildren. They're settling down. Why? Let me tell you why. This is the facsimile, a copy of the book. We happened at Brown, was so delighted to have one of the first editions. But guess what? This book has been reproduced many, many times. If you want to take a look at it, I'm sure the National Library has a copy, NTU has a copy, NUS has a copy. You know, they're just reproductions, but we have one of the original 16, 17 editions. So if you come to visit me at Brown, I will take you to see the original. It's really a beautiful book and in perfect condition. Now, here's the important thing. Look at this description by the same Antonio de Morga. He's not talking about sapphires and jewels and pearls and this and that. He's talking about what? Metal basins, copper kettles, cast iron pots, saltpeter and gunpowder, wheat flour, preserves made from orange, peach, pear, nutmeg and ginger, fruits of China, salt pork and other salt meats, live fowls, quantities of fresh fruits, chestnuts, walnuts. Also, fine threads of all kinds, needles and knickknacks, boxes and writing cases, beds, tables, chairs, furniture. No? Geese that resemble swans, horses, some mules and asses, and of course, this I love, even caged birds, some of which talk while others sing. Yeah, that's so Chinese. And finally, in this long report, he said at the end, so many things, which if I prefer to list them all, I would never finish or have sufficient paper for it. So he could have just said, etc., etc., etc. No? That's what I'm saying here now. He just couldn't fill his report. He concludes, without these sangles, the city would not be able to survive and sustain itself because they are the master of all crafts, hardworking people, and here, charge reasonable prices. That is a constant refrain we will hear over and over again from various sources. Now I'm telling you, this is 1590, very early on, okay? So again, look at this. We're talking about not export things to America and to Europe. We're talking about things that the Hokkien people brought to be used in Manila for everyday living, okay? Food, furniture, and birds that sing. Fray Domingo Salazar, who was the first bishop of Manila and Morga's contemporary and rival. This is a wonderful thing about Spaniards. They're terribly, here my Spanish friends said, they're terribly verbose. They love to write long reports, and they compete with each other to write the most wordy, reports, full of details. They compete with each other. So Fray Domingo says about the Chinese and the things, this is another important point. These articles have already begun to be manufactured here in Manila as quickly and with better finish than in China, perfecting themselves in things which they are not wont to produce in China. That is, they are not just bringing those things from China. The artisans and craftsmen have relocated to Manila and are manufacturing these things here. These are the settlers I'm talking about. And they're not just making things that they made in China, but they're making things for us, things that they don't make in China, but that we ask them to do or need here. In this Parian are to be found workmen of all trades and handicrafts of a nation, and many of them in each occupation. Now, they make much prettier articles than are made in Spain, and sometimes so cheap that I am ashamed to mention it. No? And the bishop noted, the handicrafts pursued by Spaniards have all dried out because people buy their clothes and shoes from the sangles, who are very good craftsmen in Spanish fashion and make everything, again, at very low cost. Now, this is 1590. They could not get over the fact that these Chinese could make everything in good quality and at low cost, cheap. They are so skilled and clever that as soon as they see any object made by a Spanish workman, they reproduce it with exactitude. Now, he went on to tell this great story about a bookbinder from Mexico. You know, the Europeans bind their books with leather. No? Very different from the Chinese, who just poke some holes and put some thread some thread through the holes, right? The Europeans have a very elaborate way. So this European bookbinder, this Mexican bookbinder came to Manila, set up shop, and then he hired a young Chinese Filipino to come and help him in the store, just to help him. But this young Chinese was watching how he was doing his work, and before long, he went next door and opened up his own bookbindery. And Fray Salazar, who tells the story, says the Mexican bookbinder just closed up shop and said, I can't compete with him because he does work as good as I, but cheaper. So he said, I'm going back to Mexico. I can't compete with him. I don't have business here. Okay. So the Parian of the Sangle has so adorned the city of Manila that I do not hesitate to affirm to your majesty that no other known city in Spain possesses everything as well worth seeing as this, for in it can be found the whole trade of China, etc., etc. It's a bit of an exaggeration, perhaps, but it shows his enthusiasm, his enthusiasm for what he saw. So here's a summary of the kind of things that Fray Domingo reported about the kind of Chinese businesses in the Parian, 1590 now. First of all, there were doctors and apothecaries. And I have to say to you, we think these doctors are not Western MD doctors. Even if they're not Western trained doctors, they are Chinese herbalists. And wherever we now know, you know, in Southeast Asia, we have a big Chinese herbal medicine tradition. In Cuba, the Cubans talk about the herbalists. Everywhere where Chinese went, San Francisco, Los Angeles, because the Chinese immigrants from this first moment on always brought along an herbalist or two. And for the local population among whom they resettled, who oftentimes had no other medical attention, they too learned to go to the Chinese herbalist. No? So this is a Chinese herbalist. And then eating houses where Sangle and Spaniards eat. This is the beginning of the ubiquitous Chinese restaurant. No, it happened right there. Because it not only served the Chinese, the Sangle, but the Spaniards. They quickly learned, well, you want to go eat cheap and good and lots of food? Let's go to the Chinatown. No, let's go to the Parian. Clothes and shoes made in Spanish fashion and low prices. We've already heard that. Silversmiths and painters who furnished the homes and churches with religious images copied from Spaniards. I'm going to give you some illustrations of that. Bookbinder, I already told you the story about the bookbinder, but look at the next one, very important. Gardeners, truck farmers. Also, wherever the Chinese went, they grew their own vegetables. They had truck farms or urban farms. These gardeners were raising good vegetables of the kinds that grow in Spain and Mexico. And where would Singapore food be without the chili, the hot pepper from the Americas? The yam or the sweet potato, the corn or the maize. These were all fruit products introduced from the Americas. And of course, the potato. The regular potato, the sweet potato. And artisans who made chairs, bridles, and stirrups in so good a quality and so cheaply that some merchants want to load a cargo of these for Mexico. They're not supposed to load these ordinary things on the galleon ships, you see? Very important. Bakers. Because the Spaniards, the Mexicans want their bread. No? Their European-style bread made with flour, which was brought down from China. Bakers who make good bread and sell it at low prices with wheat flour from China. And the next part that I highlighted is really important because it will be another enduring characteristic of Chinese overseas, Chinese communities everywhere in the world, extending credit to your local customers. No? Because the Chinese oftentimes began their businesses in local communities, poor communities, families with cash flow problems, soldiers in this case who weren't always paid or paid on time. And at the end of the month, the soldiers said, we're hungry, but we can't pay you. The Chinese says, not to worry. I'll note it in my little notebook. Just take what you need. And when you get paid, you can pay me back. But what Fray Domingo, remember he's a bishop, he said, the poor of the city would be, where would they be without the Chinese, no? For the poor of the city, for had they not found this refuge, they would suffer want. In other words, the Spaniards did not take care of their own people. The Chinese did. And by the way, something about these bakers, because people like their bread early in the morning for breakfast. So they made an exception and allowed the Chinese bakers to live intramuros, inside the city wall, so they can quickly deliver the hot bread to the Spanish Mexican homes. They built homes using stone, learned how to make bricks and roof tiles, again at low cost. And Chinese artisans of all kinds who learned to imitate Spanish arts and crafts, and they very quickly also learned how to repair and eventually build the galleon ships in the shipyard outside Manila called Cavite. There is no Spaniard, this is a governor, no Spaniard, secular or religious, who obtains his food, clothing, or shoes except through the Chinese. And here is an illustration. It's a little bit later on in the 18th century, but it gives you a sense of the Parian, the hustle and the bustle of the Parian. You will see people who are jewelry makers, shoe makers, hair cutting, people doing translation, writing and printing, selling oil lamps. Can you see selling oil lamps? Fruits, food, everything, and even mosquito nets. No? And do you see, if you've been to Manila, you can still see at the Binondo today, this Chinese gate. No? This is a gate to the Chinese community with Chinatown today and here are the original hawkers, no? The street vendors and hawkers in the Parian. No? The noodle stand, right? These are all very familiar to us here in Singapore. When I talk about these in the United States and other Western countries, they find this really exotic, these hawkers, selling food on the streets and whatever. I said, yeah, wait till you get to Singapore, okay? Now, Fray Domingo had also said this. He said, what arouses my wonder most is when I arrived here, the Sangle hardly knew how to paint anything. But now they have so perfected themselves in this art that they produce marvelous work with both the brush and the chisel. Look at this gorgeous painting, a religious painting in the Western style by a Chinese artist circa 1585, and you can still see it in the Binondo Church of Manila. No? It's a Western painting. No? Later on, there'll be so many of them. They no longer were curiosities, but in the beginning, when they found these Chinese could very quickly learn how to paint in a different way, they were, of course, duly impressed. So, the Parian. First American Chinatown because it was an extension of Mexico. It was indispensable for both the Manila galleon trade of luxury items from China and from the Indian Ocean world, and indispensable to the sustainability of the Mexican-Spanish community in Manila. And third, as the first truly large Chinese community overseas, and easily the largest one in the 16th century. My source for this is the eminent Professor Wang Gongwu of NUS here in Singapore. It can be said to mark the beginning of the Chinese diaspora. For the Chinese in Manila changed from being sojourners and traders to permanent settlers and community builders. But all was not well. Already, this prolific Antonio de Morga, this prolific and loquacious Antonio de Morga, had some misgivings about the Chinese from the very beginning, even as he sang their praises. He says, from this a lot of trouble arises, referring to the growing numbers of Chinese, because with so many infidels, there could be little security in the land. They are bad and vicious people. Moreover, he said, with so many of them and being big eaters, we are short of food because of what they consume. And he also noticed, and I thought this is an interesting description, but it could be made in comparison to the darker-skinned local people. They are white, light complexioned, I think he means, tall, with little facial hair, strong, good workers, and skilled in arts and crafts. But he hastened to add that they were also phlegmatic, people of low energy. He must have heard Donald Trump on the campaign trail, right? He says the Chinese are people of low energy, traitorous and cruel, even with their own people, and very greedy. So here on the one hand, they say they make nice things and charge low prices, but on the other hand, they're saying they're greedy, no? And so he betrayed very on this ambivalence about the Chinese. So guess what? Another recurrent theme from that moment on throughout the history of the Chinese diaspora, or the Chinese overseas: Sinophobia, anti-Chinese violence. In Chinese, we have this wonderful term, Pai Hua. No? Recurring patterns of destruction and then the rebuilding of the Parian. In just the 17th century alone, that happened 4 times: 1603, 1639, 1662, 1668. Why? Why was there this kind of devastation periodically? First, there were tension already in Manila around the time of the first clash. The Parian population had grown to be as high as 30,000. Remember, the Spanish-Mexican population was about 1,000. So the sheer size by comparison of the Chinese was threatening. Second, this is my tribute to my Dutch friend here. The Dutch were forcing their way into Manila, and the Portuguese were still hanging around. No? And that added to the tension and anxiety that the Spaniards were feeling. On the part of the Chinese themselves, and the Sangley, the Hokkien people of the Parian, they deeply resented heavy and arbitrary taxes and fees imposed only on them. This is another recurring theme, no? And so when the Chinese in Manila protested, loudly against these fees and taxes, the Spanish moved their soldiers in, destroyed the Parian, which was not difficult to do because the Parian was built mainly of wood. Just burned it down and massacred, so it said, 25,000 people. The rest they deported back to China. It was a massacre. It was a destruction of the Parian. Ethnic cleansing, an example? Well, one Spanish historian, Manuel Oye, contemporary historian, makes this argument. Manila would have been an absolutely unviable city without the presence of Chinese residents and traders. But at the same time, Spaniards hated the Chinese, feared them, and denigrated them. Now, soon after the 1603 massacre and expulsion, guess what? The Mexicans and Spaniards in Manila sent strong signals to Minnan, to southern Fujian, and says, come back, come back. We need you. We can't do things without you. And the Chinese were just waiting for their signal because they came pouring back because guess what? The Chinese, good practical businessmen. There's good business in Manila that they didn't want to forsake or to give up. So the pattern would repeat itself. 1639 again, 1662, 1668, and this is just in the 17th century. Chinese revolt followed by violent and bloody Spanish suppression and punishment. And why? Now, I'm just going to offer a very, I won't say simplistic, but in a quick way. No, maybe later some of you will have more insights into this, but I think it's a case of the very close and intimate nature of these Chinese shopkeepers, service providers, and their Spanish-Mexican clients that led to this type of resentment and even hatred, as the Spanish historian Manuel Oye says. It is precisely the close and intimate daily interaction, it's a little counterintuitive, right, between Chinese and Spaniards in every facet of local life that provoked intense Spanish fear of this high degree of Chinese penetration into their lives and their material interests. Spanish response to their anxiety was to shut down the Parian periodically, then allow it to reopen and resume business as usual. So, before I go on and show you some beautiful slides, I should tell you a little bit about the silver that went from America to the Philippines, because the silver really was desired by China. China was converting its currency system from paper to silver. And the Mexican silver that was brought over there, the Peruvian silver, the American silver, was coined silver in the mints of Mexico. And they were desired because they were of high silver content and consistent in their content. That's the value of these silver coins. No? And these silver coins, in the pirate movies, you hear them talk a lot about pieces of 8. No? In Spanish, it's real de la ocho, because each one of these big silver coins was divided into 8 pieces, and sometimes the pieces were even broken off. No? Real de la ocho, the pieces of 8. For 1597, an estimated 12 million pesos, or 307 kilograms of silver, flowed to China. For 1600, the amount sent to China was estimated as 6 million pesos, about half as much. During the late Ming era, that is from the late 16th century into the middle of the 17th century, an estimated annual average of 5 million Spanish dollars or pesos was smuggled out of Mexico in trade with China. This is the other side of the trade, the non-official trade, and that involved 5 million pesos. Legal trade combined with the contraband trade is estimated to average 2 million pesos or 50 tons of pure silver throughout the 17th century. That is the late Ming into the early Qing. No, this is just an average. And of course, this is why pirates were hovering all around Manila. No? American silver became so important to China and the world economy that the Mexican peso or silver dollar became the global standard of exchange for worldwide trade in Europe, North America, Central Asia, China, Japan, and all over Asia, this Nanyang area, forming the basis of the modern world system. In establishing the silver standard and its importance in China's emerging economic relationships with the world outside, these Hokkien entrepreneurs in Manila played a critical role because they were the ones who transmitted the silver from Manila to China. No? Very important. And so here is the Potosi mines, which was a part of colonial Peru and is today in Bolivia. It is a single richest silver mine in all of the Americas. I have to tell you something about the word Potosi. You know how we use the brand name Kleenex to refer to all kinds of tissue paper? Potosi is the name for silver mine, and there's a Potosi, Mexico. There's even a Potosi in Missouri, United States. These are all silver mines. No? So if you ever see a place name called Potosi anywhere in the world, you can bet it was a silver mine. And this is an earlier version of the Real de Ocho, no? And this is a later version, 1761, no? Of the Real de Ocho. You can go buy one on eBay right now. Just go up on eBay. There's so many of them that you can buy one, and they're nice and big, no? Spanish dollars or Mexican dollars. So Manila as a port or entrepot, a border, a contact and exchange zone. We talked about trade and commerce. I'm going to talk very quickly about language and culture. intellectual exchange of religion, science, and technology, of ideas and of books, and material and visual. And this is the last part of my lecture, but I want to tell you things that I think will be truly impressive. First of all, among the first Chinese craftsmen to settle in Manila were the Chinese printers, because Chinese already had an advanced form of printing. This is a Filipino-Chinese printer called Thomas Pipin, using the Chinese woodblock technique. And this I also found at the John Carter Brown Library of Brown University. This is actually a facsimile, not an original, but of a very early book printed by Thomas Pipin in 1610. It's called Arte y Reglas de la Lengua Tagala. It's printed for the missionaries to go among the Tagalog-speaking people, the native people who were Tagalog speakers in Luzon Island. And this is a dictionary, Spanish-Tagalog dictionary, 1610. And these 4 books are all catechisms published in Manila by another Chinese painter called Ken Yong in 1593. There were 4 books. One is a Doctrina Cristiana in Lengua Española y Tagalog, Spanish and Tagalog Christian doctrines. Number 2, Apología de la verdadera religión, a defense of the true religion. Doctrina Cristiana y Letra Lengua China. Number 3 is the Christian doctrine, the Catholic doctrines in Chinese. First time we see Christian doctrines in Chinese. Translated by a Dominican missionary called Juan Cobo. And finally, a Shi Lu, which is the first book written by a Westerner in Chinese. So let me tell you, because I don't want to leave you with an impression that all Manila was trade and commerce, that all Manila was money exchanging hands. No, I want to tell you other things went on, and these are some of the other beautiful and deeply impressive things. The Dominican missionary Juan Cobo, I call him the first Western sinologist. He arrived in Manila in 1588 and was assigned to convert the Chinese. Now, I don't think he was very successful in converting a lot of Chinese, but you know what? He very quickly learned Chinese. He learned to speak probably Hokkien, and most importantly, he learned to read and write Chinese. And he published 3 books in which he introduced Chinese doctrines as well as Western science to China in Chinese. And these are his books. One thing is called the 冰星铺干民心保健 in 普通话, and in Hokkien I think it will be 冰星铺干, which is a precious mirror of the clear heart. The other and second book is 辩证教正传世录, the discussion of the true religion. Okay, it's a book that he wrote for the educated Chinese, the gentry, the intellectuals. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about these books. The 冰星报刊, the 明心宝鉴, or the Precious Mirror, was a translation from Chinese to translation, of the original Chinese published in 1393 by this guy, Fang Libing. This is a translation of this Chinese book into Spanish. But Ken Yong, his publisher, his printer, issued a bilingual edition with the original Chinese on the left side and his Spanish translation on the other, and it dealt with ethics and human relations. Here it is. This is the book, and here's the bilingual edition. The Chinese original, 1393, and the Spanish translation on the other side. His other book, this one, which we shortened to the term Shi Lu, just the last 2 words, has a cumbersome title in translation, Authentic Record of the Discussion of the True Spread of the Orthodox Faith. But it was framed as a scientific exchange between East and West. It's written as a dialogue form. First book written in Chinese by a European, and it is the first book to state in Chinese that the earth is round and not flat. And he offers scientific proof. This is just one page from the Shilu, written in Chinese. Okay, these are all the different chapters of his book on the nature of the earth, infinite things, animals, plants, you know. It's a scientific book, no? But also a discussion on the proofs of the true religion, written for an educated reading public in China. But here is the fourth chapter. It is the most important from the scientific point of view because he introduces a European cosmological system of his time, the cosmology, and the text offers the first clear expression of the roundness of the earth ever written in Chinese language and offering arguments to prove it. So I have taken this. For those of you who know better math than I do, geometry, you can read the Chinese, you can see. No? This is the mathematical scientific proof that Huang Kobo offered. So here it is in the original language. So that's intellectual exchange. No? Now let's talk about the cultural exchange. Let's talk about things that were brought over or things that were made in America, copied from the Chinese. Okay? So this is a typical lacquer tray, inlaid lacquer wood. See that? This is a beautiful lacquered and painted writing desk. A desk in the European style, but lacquer, which is a Asian, Chinese, and Japanese style. This is probably actually the Japanese lacquer style, the makei. And the decorations is definitely Asian, no? And this is yet another, it's a private oratory. We found this in Brazil in private possession, a polychrome and gilded wood. And I'm sorry, this painting is not very, this image is not very clear, but in all the panels you see they are Chinese motifs or Asian motifs. This is another religious painting of the late 16th century, which is oil and copper. No? Now this one is one of my favorites. If you go to Mexico City today, there's a wonderful private museum called the Franz Mayer Museum. It's a private collection of things from Asia. And this big face basin, in the old days before you have bathrooms inside the house, in every room, in the middle class and affluent families, there's a big basin with water. So when you get up in the morning, you wash your face. No? And what is interesting about this, if you look carefully at this, is that, yeah, it's the typical, you know, white and blue porcelain. It has the typical decorations inside that reflects the Chinese countryside. But look at what this artisan put in the back. What is this? This is the Cathedral of Mexico City. No? So we think that this plate was probably made by a Mexican artisan who was taught the art of making pottery by a Chinese artisan, because one of the things that was also shipped over to America were Chinese artisans to Mexico to teach them how to make some of these fine things. So this is another example, no, of a pottery made in America, but using Chinese decorative motifs. And these tiles made in Puebla, Mexico, which is famous for tile making, you look at the figures, Asians and Europeans. This is a Japanese samurai, and then, by the way, there was also a small Japanese community in Manila. They were Japanese Catholics who were expelled from Japan when the Tokugawa Ieyasu decided to close off Japan to the missionaries, to Catholicism, and then expelled a lot of converted Japanese. No? They made their way on the galleon ships and sought refuge in Mexico. These are examples in private art possessions, not in museums, of beautiful Asian porcelain. No? So these were sold in the American market. Now here is another example. This is a church steeple in Brazil today. You can still see it. It's made up of broken dishes. Because what we found in the galleon dishes is they also packed a lot of very common and coarse dishes for ballast, for the balance of the ship. And then they were sold very cheaply and usually used to feed slaves and poor people. And in this case in Brazil, these plates were used by slaves when they broke. Somebody had the brilliant idea, instead of just throwing them away, why don't we decorate the church steeple with these broken sherds? Now this is a beautiful painting, one of my favorites. She's of the Countess of Monteblanco of Lima, 18th century. And you say, okay, Evelyn, so what? What are you showing this for? Why am I showing you this? Her dress is made of Chinese silk. The lace is Belgium lace, of course. This is a kind of Spanish-style clothing that they were making in Manila, and they were making, in this case, in Peru, but using the large amounts of Chinese silk and material that was brought over. You can see this beautiful pink and all the embroidery. Remember Antonio de Morga's description of the silk? He talked about embroidered silk, no? Okay, this is tapestry, bedspread. That was also one of the descriptions. Now, this is just an ordinary painting, famous set of paintings in Mexico called casta paintings of ordinary people, mostly mixed race people. The little girl here you can see is a mixed race, right? But that's not the point. That's not why I'm showing you. I'm showing you that in this painting, this woman, she is also wearing Chinese silk or material from China. Huh? This is in the Denver Art Museum. Huh? You can just about go to any art museum anywhere in the world, and you can probably find paintings like this. But you wouldn't know you're looking at Chinese silk, you see? Because they don't always say that. In fact, they never say that. No, they don't say so. But we know, the art historians who have taught me, have shown me what to look for. This is Chinese silk. So is this gentleman wearing the waistcoat, Chinese material, Chinese silk, and so are all these other examples. See? Tapestry. What do we know? We know these chrysanthemum, we know the imaginary animals. No? These are all from China and Asia. No? The chrysanthemum. No? A tapestry is what you hang on the wall. A carpet is what you put on the wall, right? So this is a tapestry. And then the ivory. Remember the ivory? Remember how the Spaniards and the Mexicans were so impressed by the Chinese artisans. They say, we show them something, they copy it, and they copy it so well, and they do it so cheap. Well, this is it. This is St. Geronimus, polychrome ivory. Look at this. Group of ivory Christ and the cross. Guess what? You can see this everywhere. Very common. Hundreds, thousands of these must be made. There's one at the Harvard Museum. I went to see it. Okay, so this is ivory. No? Look at this, Archangel St. Michael, ivory. Ivory, infant Jesus, no? Anatomically correct little baby Jesus, right? And this, the beloved Santa Rosa de Lima, lots of these little figurines were made and sold in the Americas. Our Lady of Guadalupe, who is the saint of Mexico, wooden figure with ivory hands and face. Here's a close-up of another one. Look at that beautiful ivory face. Look at those soft hands. And then I put this in because this is just a painting of a painter's cupboard. I put this in because you see the plate there. The plate there, which is just a way of saying every household has something Chinese. If it's not something they wore, it's something they ate from, it's something else that they used. And I told you too that Mexico, until the middle of the 19th century, extended all the way into what is today USA, America Southwest. And this is some porcelain sherds that were excavated at San Juan Pueblo, which is in New Mexico. And these sherds, archaeology found, was similar to this late 16th century Ming Dynasty bowl. No? How did it end up all the way up in New Mexico? Because the colonial officials, we know from reading their wills, that they took Chinese porcelain, Chinese silk, in their suitcases when they were sent to these outposts. And then the Jesuits also created an art school where they taught the local artists how to paint. But this painting, late 16th century, very early watercolor, is a religious painting, but you can see the influence still, the lingering influence of the Asian face, no? Japanese in particular, the little cherry lips, the downcast eyes. No, this face is not European, it's Asian. And then I want to share the last group, and then I'll be done. This is, of course, the Madonna, right? We all know that. Madonna with the baby Jesus. This is also made in Philippines, no? But then the Filipino artists and others got a little creative. This is an example of cultural syncretism. They say, you know what? We have somebody who's a little bit like the Madonna, but we relate to that person better. So they took the Guan Yin, and they took the Madonna and they put a baby in Guan Yin's hands. Now, this is not an anomaly. We have plenty of examples. This is a stucco sculpture found in Taiwan in the 18th century. And it's a Guan Yin figure with a baby. You know? And finally, I want to show you this contract, 1634. This is a Japanese businessman, one of those Catholics who were driven to go to Guadalajara, Mexico, the second largest city of Mexico, the most religious city of Mexico. And he did a lot of business there, and this just happened to be his contract with a local businessman to do what? To make tequila. You know tequila? I wish we have some tequila here. Tequila, because tequila is a product of Guadalajara. No? So what better proof do you need? No? 1634. Well before the railroads, well before Hawaii, well before this, there were Asians in the Americas. No? So now, finally, would you look at your handouts? I have, your seat, you have two handouts, right? You know, whenever I give a public lecture, I'd like to give you something that you can take with you, if you like. First, let's look at the 1689 census. It's a back-to-back, but look at this one. It's a 1689 census of non-Christian Chinese occupations in Manila's Parian. Look at all these different occupations and services and shops and what they make. Now, some of them, we translated the best we could, but we couldn't quite figure out what they are. Maybe some of you know. What is a buyo? B-U-Y-O? I was hoping some of you Hokkien people would know. What is a tahug? T-A-H-U-G? See, we don't know what these things are. But most of the others, are pretty common, right? Silk vendors, blankets, foundry men, net makers, wax chandeliers, silver seers. Does anything? Tobacco, don't forget tobacco. That's another American product for which you have lots to thank, right? Tobacco and sugar. Umbrella maker, box maker, locksmith, fisherman. You know what a petate is, right? That's a Mexican word. We call it in Chinese 席子, it's a straw mat, no? A petate. Boatman, druggist, or pharmacist. Barbers, always Chinese barbers. Chinese tailors, brokers, brazier men, coal, dyers, boatmen, rope makers, tea dealers, cooks, porters, oil dealers, etc., etc. This just happens to be a census of the Parian. The Chinese who agree to convert and marry, usually local women, were given a different neighborhood to live in. No? Okay, then finally, I want to share a poem. Now, why do I give you this Spanish poem? Well, I want to give you something Spanish because we're talking about Spanish Manila, but look at this poem. It's a poem, a long poem, an epic poem. I'll just give you one page of it by Bernardo de Balbuena. It's called Grandeza Mexicana, the grandeur of Mexico. It was in its time a bestseller all over Latin America and all over Europe. But look what I wanted to show you. I put in yellow, it wouldn't reproduce in this copy, all the place names that were named here. Peru, Chile, Cambrai, Quinsay, Sicilia, Syria, Arabia, Hormuz, India, Gallardos, Goa, Siam, España, Filipinas, Macon, Havas, the Javas, Caspis, Troglodita, Malabar, we know Malabar, Idaspes, I don't quite know where that place is. Egipto, we know Pankaya, I don't know where it is. Persia, we know. Aetolia, that's Greece. La Gran China, Roma, Milan. 1604, this was the world of America, of, in particular, New Spain, Mexico, and of the rest of the Spanish Empire, and from there to Europe. 1604, they knew about the world. Look at all the place names that this poem read in this poem that he called The Grandeur of Mexico. So, Mexico, because of the galleon trade, because of the Chinese in Manila and their connection to the galleon trade, really became a worldly, cosmopolitan place, connected to practically the whole known world at the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evelyn. Anyone has any question or comments? Okay. May I request that you use the mic so everybody can hear your questions?
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I learned quite a bit. One image that struck me quite is the image of the baby Jesus with Guan Yin. And it reminded me of a trip I made a few years ago to Manila. And I went to a very old Catholic church just as a tourist to take a look at what the church had. And outside the church, at a corner, there was a cross, very small. It's actually a small cross. It's like a window that to the wall, the corner of that big, very old church, probably in Manila. And then there were a few women there praying, burning incense, the joss sticks, to the cross. And so I remember asking, what are you praying to? But I got no answer. And I asked in Chinese, and she understood Chinese, but she didn't answer me what she was praying to, or who she was praying to. It's just the cross. To me, it was just the cross and the ash urns and all. And so, if the image that you showed us seems to be going back quite some time, this practice, why was it tolerated by the Catholic Church? But apparently, the church didn't mind that the joss sticks was burned in front of the church, the cross. So there must be some sort of kind of a synthesized culture emerging, that the Catholic Church was quite tolerant or accepting of the essentially Taoist practice of praying. I don't know whether my guess is right or not.
You answered your own question very well. It's a syncretism, which we find the syncretism. Maybe somebody else in the audience could explain that further. Yes? The religious syncretism, which is, right? You know the Chinese didn't convert in large numbers. They never did.
I was in Philippines for a while. And basically, you ask a Filipino, what's your race? He will say, I'm 8% Spanish, 8% Chinese, 8% I think Spanish or whatever. So they don't have an exact religion. And if I were to go to the south of the Philippines where Zamboanga, Cotabato is, and they put all this Jesus Christ, Guan Yin, Taoist, whatever. And you ask them, who are you praying? I pray all.
Yeah, I hedge my bet.
I pray all.
I pay.
So I have no offense. I pray all. So I don't offend anybody. That's how they were brought up. You ask them why Guan Yin is beside Jesus, beside this, beside that. They say they pray all. Because they have already mixed percentage. Most of the Filipino are already 1%. How many percent mix already?
It's not just a mix, it's a blend.
The blend of, you ask them how many percent, they can't tell.
Salad where you keep each item separate, it's really blending
Yep.
it into a different whole.
Yeah.
Here's a question here.
Yeah, I was just curious where you were describing how the Spanish periodically suppressed the Chinese. Was that a racial thing or was that a religious thing? Because obviously in Latin America, they did forced conversions. So if the Chinese people had become Catholic, would they then have been able to integrate with the Spanish community?
Did you all heard that, right? This periodic massacre, near extermination. Was it religious? Was it racial? No? Well, I tried to suggest something. I don't think it was pure racial, but of course the racial element was there because oftentimes what happens in these kind of massive violent actions and reactions is that race then can become a justification for doing that. Because if you, the few passages that I cited from Antonio de Morga verged on a racial description of the Chinese. You know, of what we would today call, remember, they are phlegmatic, they are low energy, they are greedy, they are cruel, they are vicious, no? Right? He said all these things a few years before the first major uprising. But already they were sort of preparing in their own minds reasons for doing something to the Chinese. But and I don't think it's religious, no? Because the religion element, I don't think plays such a big role. I think it is something more complex that I try to suggest in this very brief description, that the Spaniards, there were only 1,000 of them or so. They lived surrounded by threats, no? Surrounded by threats, and they became very anxious, no? So they reacted in this against the people that they were very intimate with. These are people that they saw every day. Did you have a comment?
My question pertains to the number of ships that was involved in this galleon trade.
How many?
I'm curious about the number of ships that was involved in this galleon trade. I think you mentioned about only 1 or 2 per year.
Yeah.
Why is that so little, or is it because the sheer length of the journey such that only 1 or 2 survived?
Journey, I mean, it's big, and you know what? I didn't go into the details. You figure it out. 250 years, right? Some of the same ships, if they survived the voyage, they would make another one. But there were shipwrecks, there were pirate attacks. I mean, it was a perilous journey. No, it was a perilous journey, very long. Pardon me?
The trade winds probably.
Blew them off, but they were good at following the trade winds. That's why they learned, yeah.
Chinese came after this one.
The Chinese?
Yeah.
Where?
Later to Peru.
Yes. But the galleon ship brought Chinese. There are census in Peru, early 17th century, with Chinese on them. So they were there already. Yes, please.
I love the census numbers here.
Yeah.
I was curious about the ratio of male to female.
Yes. Very
And
good
the
question.
second question I have also is,
Yeah.
you said 500 to 1,000 of the Spanish. What about the soldiers? How many soldiers did they have?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the precise numbers because I'm not sure they exist. First of all, the gender balance, right? Of course, unquestionably, there were more men. But there were women because there were families. However, a lot of the wives were probably local women because typically then, as later, these Chinese immigrants would have a wife at home in the village. They go overseas and they would pick up another wife, right? You know, you get lonely, right? So they form another family. It's common, you know? So, but I don't know. Nobody, I've not seen anybody who's broken down. And guess what? That's a very good question because none of the Spanish informers commented on women. Now, those are guys. They didn't look for women. They weren't paying attention. They did talk about the Christian, those who accepted conversion. One of the conditions for conversion is that they had to marry. And they were the ones who married mostly local women, and they started producing the next few generations of mestizos, the Filipino today who are mostly mestizos, people raised. Yeah. What was the other question? The number of soldiers. Well, many of those 1,000 or so, many of them were soldiers, but I don't have the exact breakdown. But you can probably envision it, right? Church people, not too many. I mean, how many bishops do you need in Manila? No? High government officials, not too many, because they have, certain offices. But remember, Manila was being administered by the Viceroy of New Spain or Mexico, so they didn't have viceroys. The highest government was in Audiencia, which is a court, an appeals court. And Antonio de Morga, who I cited, was one of the chief judges of this court. That was as high as a government, right? So not too many government officials, right? Merchants, yes, there were a few, but not a whole lot. Remember, there were no Spanish shopkeepers, no Mexican businessmen of that order. So they were mostly there involved with the galleon trade. So you added up probably a good percentage of the 1,000 or so were soldiers, because they were the ones to keep the peace, to control the population.
A significant portion of the galleon trade was on the illegal side.
Yes.
How did that work out in terms of the ships? Was it just the product, some would slide off the back, or did they have an equal number of ships plying that route?
Good question. The illegal trade, remember I mentioned very briefly so much silver was illegal. This long voyage was such that it was not very easy for someone to send a ship illegally that nobody saw. Right? So the illegal contraband side was really in the merchandise itself. Okay? There were, of course, lots of rules and regulations and whatever about who could buy, who could put merchandise, who could whatever. And there were lots of unregistered merchandise, shall we say. Right? Because, hey, if you were spending, everybody's trying to make a buck out of this stuff. So every soldier, a soldier, for example, would have a bundle of stuff and put it on the ship and say, somebody will pick it up at the other end. Right? That's contraband, see? Because the official trade had to be only government regulated. Lots of the merchandise went under the official trade. Yes.
So how long would the voyage have taken, and how many people?
Each galleon. Good question. I've been working on the Chinese community now. I've got to start paying more attention to the ships, right? Because I can't answer your good questions. Okay. This is before steam. This is fan chuan. These are, sails. So they need hundreds of people. They are called galley slaves. And they were mostly native Filipinos, but there were also a few Chinese who were recruited. No Spaniards or Mexicans would have to do that, right? So hundreds of them, 300 about them, I heard, they literally work in the galleys. No? And so each voyage would take 4 months, maybe, average, 3 to 4 months. And we're talking about a round trip. No? If it's a good day without a lot of storms or whatever, maybe they can make it from Acapulco to Manila, maybe in 4 weeks, a month, right? So, yeah.
Hi, I'm particularly interested in what you mentioned about the imposition of tax for certain groups of people, like the Chinese immigrants. And then you have groups of people coming from the Spanish people with different roles, like the governments and the administrative people. So does that implicitly mean that there is some kind of a special relationship between these two groups of people? And are there any explicit activities, that arise from there? But there are also the conflict and the tension. So people always go and then come back and then they go again. So yeah, can you just give us more insight into
let's
that?
just talk about the Spaniards first. These are Spaniards sent out mostly from Mexico to the colony, to the extension of the colony in Manila. And they will rotate, right? Antonio de Morga was there for a few years, and he went back to Mexico, and from Mexico he went to Peru. You know, and the missionaries too, no? So those groups moved around a lot. I imagine the soldiers did well, because the Spaniards, for the most part, we settlers. They are not immigrants in mentality. They are not transplanting themselves. They are not relocating permanently. No? They are only assigned to work in what we call an entrepot. It's not even a complete city. That's what I was trying to, from the Spanish point of view, it's a small number of people. They didn't have to bring along a lot of different types of workers. They didn't have to grow their own food. They had the Chinese to do that. They don't have to make their own furniture. They didn't have to do a lot of things, right? Remember the bookbinder? He quickly went home because, you know. So that's the nature of the Spanish community, and that's the nature of entrepôts in general, everywhere in the world. Entrepôt is a wonderful, it's a French word, you know, the O has a cap on it. It's an intermediary city, and it's mainly for trade. So Manila is a perfect example of a trading port or entrepôt, no? So that's the thing. Now, what was the other part of the question now? You asked about the Spaniards. I thought you had another question.
No, I asked about the implicit relationship between the Chinese.
Yeah, that's what I told. See, it was very intimate relationship because everything the Spaniards needed, they had to get it from the Chinese. Their food, their clothing, their entertainment. And listen, somebody's bound to ask me about prostitutes. I'm sure they were there too. I just don't have a whole lot of information on it. But you can bet that they existed too, right? That's a service. It's a good service. So the Chinese provided every kind of service, every kind of goods that they need. So I call it a very intimate, meaning close relationship. No, the bakers who gave food to the soldiers when they didn't have cash. No, that kind of thing. The stonemasons who build their homes, everything. So it's a very close, and that is an important point to make because all over Southeast Asia, all over the Americas, you have a similar characteristic of Chinese communities providing a lot of goods and services, and that very intimacy. Think about it. It's that very intimacy that breeds contempt, that breeds resentment, no?
I have a question. I have a question about why didn't they go further to other countries in Asia? Was it because the Portuguese were already in Formosa, or they said like the Chinese will come to us once we are in the Philippines? So.
Good question. Why did the Chinese go further? First of all, they couldn't get on the mainland because the Chinese emperor said, "You guys stay away." They tried. The Spanish tried, but they weren't successful. Now that's why the Chinese said to the Spanish, "You guys stay in Manila." Even before that, they told the Portuguese, "You guys stay in Macau." And a few years later, they told the Dutch, "You guys go to Batavia," which is Jakarta today, right? And then later on, when the British came along, what they say to the British, after the Opium War, after they, you know, they said, "Why don't you guys stay in Hong Kong," right? So they really, the Chinese and the Japanese too, did not want these foreigners to come on the shore, onto the mainland. Because they were afraid of what would happen, and rightly so, probably, right? So they told them all to stay offshore if they could. And then the other thing that I think I tried to make very clear, I think there was no incentive or motivation for the Spaniards to go farther than Manila because the Hokkien traders, the Chinese, were bringing them all the stuff from the Indian Ocean. And it's true, the Portuguese were there too, and the Portuguese says, "Hey, don't mess around with us, you know." The Portuguese were very actively involved in this whole area, doing what we call the carrying trade. The Portuguese did not do the same thing the Spaniards did. First of all, they had no silver, so the Chinese weren't particularly interested in trading with them. They were mostly carrying things from one place to another. For example, Japan also produced silver, and it was mainly the Portuguese who carried the silver from Japan to other places, to Manila and other places. See? So that's the role that the Portuguese played.
Okay, I'm just going to take one last question from this lady.
May I know the origin of the word Manila?
Manila.
And when was the place named Manila, please?
I suspect it's the local name that already was there. Does anybody else know where the origin of the word Manila is? It's not Spanish, but it sounds very Spanish, right? Manila. ¿No es español, verdad? No, no es de origen español. Is that right? I think it's a local name because how the Spaniards learned about Manila was through the local people. The local people say, hey, there's a much better place in Manila Bay because it's protected by the bay. You will be in a much better location. So they left Cebu Island and they went to Manila, which is on Luzon Island. These are all the local names. Just like the word Sangley, which was used to refer to the Chinese from the very beginning, it's the local word. You never hear the word Sangley in any part of Southeast Asia. Nobody else uses it except in that period. And in Manila today, in the Philippines today, I don't think the word is used anymore. No? They're called, what do we call the Chinese now in the Philippines? Come on. Chinoy, right? Yeah, Chinese Filipinos, exactly. Yes, wait, excuse me. Somebody else had here first, okay? And then I come to you. Yeah.
Manila, I come across, there is called Manila rope. This rope is for ship use. Is the rope, you know.
After the Manila phase, they're asking when was the origin of Manila. No. She has a question.
Looking at the Chinese in the Straits settlements, a settled community inevitably has to develop a legal system for settling disputes, for deciding who's entitled to inherit. Now, for the Chinese in the Straits settlements, the British organized that, and they interpreted custom and the whole case law. What was the equivalent in Manila?
Well, that's a very good question, too. The Chinese, I think that they had their own internal system of government. The Chinese, wherever they went, because the Chinese was already a very advanced culture and civilization, they didn't leave. They were what?
Somebody has to.
There were people in charge. That's the whole thing. See, you got to go inside the community to find out, because outside the community, oftentimes they don't see and don't understand what's going on inside. For example, what the Spanish did for the Parian is they would appoint a Christian Chinese to be the gobernador. That's the word they use, governor, gobernador of the Parian, no? And that Christian Chinese is supposed to be the eyes and ears for the Spaniards, right? But the Chinese themselves, through their associations, through their huiguan, through their associates, they're very well organized. And because these are people mainly from a small place in southern Fujian, they were already, they really were part of one culture. They spoke the same language. They had the same ways of doing things and the same, I think, customary rules and things. I think that they had their own internal structure, which was very well developed, but outsiders didn't always see them.